That afternoon, the radiant golden sunlight streamed through the tree branches, casting shimmering patches of light on the brick-paved road. Alex, a 13-year-old boy with sun-kissed skin and a bright smile, was cycling around the neighborhood. This was his favorite activity every afternoon after school. Feeling the cool breeze ruffle his hair, listening to birds chirping in the treetops, and soaking in the tranquil sights of his residential area. As he cycled past a small yellow house with a meticulously cared-for garden, Alex suddenly stopped. In the front yard, an elderly woman with snow-white hair was hunched over an old TV set placed on the grass. Her face was etched with frustration, and her trembling hands tried to adjust the controls on the TV. But all her efforts seemed futile. Alex stopped his bike and curiously observed. The elderly woman was no stranger to him. She was Mrs. Helen, a neighbor who always greeted him with a warm smile whenever he passed by. Sometimes, she would even give him fragrant cookies she baked herself. However, recently, Alex had noticed that she appeared less frequently, and the once vibrant flower garden had not been as well kept as before. Without hesitation, Alex parked his bike by the roadside and walked over. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Helen," Alex called out, trying not to startle her. "What are you doing? Is your TV broken?" Mrs. Helen looked up, her eyes brightening a little when she saw him. "Oh, Alex, I'm just trying to fix this TV. It's so old it probably wants to retire," she said with a faint smile, though there was a trace of sadness in her expression. "Do you need any help? I'm pretty good with electronics," Alex offered, his eyes filled with sincerity. Mrs. Helen hesitated for a moment but then nodded. "If you don't mind, I would be so grateful. I don't want to throw it away. It's the last gift Mr. Henry gave me before he passed." Hearing this, Alex felt a strange sense of emotion. He knew Mr. Henry was Mrs. Helen's husband, a devoted police officer. Alex crouched down and carefully inspected the cables at the back of the TV, his hands deftly disconnecting and reconnecting the components. After a few minutes of fiddling, the TV suddenly turned on, emitting the familiar sounds of a television program. "See, it's working now," Alex exclaimed, his face lighting up with joy. Mrs. Helen looked at the TV screen and then back at Alex, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Oh, Alex, you truly are a little angel. Thank you so much. You have no idea how much this means to me." The next day, Alex couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Helen. He felt that she didn't just need her TV fixed but also someone to share her thoughts with. In the afternoon, Alex rode his bike back to the little yellow house, carrying a bouquet of fresh roses his mother had just picked from their garden. When Alex knocked on the door, Mrs. Helen opened it with a look of surprise. "Alex, you've come to visit me again? You're so kind." "Yes, I wanted to make sure the TV is still working fine, and I brought you some flowers. I noticed your garden looked a bit quiet, so I thought you might like these," Alex replied. Mrs. Helen looked at the bouquet of roses, her eyes welling up slightly. "You're so thoughtful. Alex, come in. I just finished baking a batch of cookies." Alex didn't hesitate to step inside. Mrs. Helen's house exuded warmth and peace. Old photos of her and Mr. Henry adorned the walls, evoking images of a happy life that had passed. They sat in the kitchen, enjoying cookies and warm milk together. Mrs. Helen began to share stories about Mr. Henry, her kind-hearted husband who always prioritized his family. Alex listened intently, sensing the deep longing she had for him. Mr. Henry always believed that a small act of kindness could change a life, Mrs. Helen said, her gaze distant. "And yesterday, you did that for me." The stories about Mr. Henry became a bond between Alex and Mrs. Helen. One afternoon, Mrs. Helen invited Alex into the living room, where she kept an old wooden box. She opened the box and took out a vintage watch. The watch had a simple design but was well preserved, with the words "Always be kind" engraved on its face. This was Mr. Henry's watch. "He always wore it while on duty," she said, her voice filled with pride. "Every time he looked at it, It reminded him that his job wasn't just about protecting people, but also about helping them. Alex gazed at the watch, feeling a special connection. Mrs. Helen, I want to be like Mr. Henry. I want to help people. Mrs. Helen smiled, her eyes sparkling with joy. You're already doing so well, Alex, and I believe you will achieve even greater things. Gradually, Alex learned more about Mrs. Helen's life. It wasn't just the loss of Mr. Henry she was dealing with. She also faced deep loneliness. With no children by her side, she lived alone in the quiet house. I used to have such a beautiful garden, Mrs. Helen shared one afternoon as the two of them sat on the front steps. But after Mr. Henry passed, I just didn't have the strength to take care of it anymore. Alex sat silently, deep in thought. He knew he couldn't change her past, but he could do something to make her present feel brighter. Mrs. Helen, how about I help you take care of the garden? We can plant beautiful flowers again, just like before. Mrs. Helen hesitated for a moment, but the enthusiasm and kindness in Alex's eyes made her nod. If you don't mind, I would be delighted. The next day, Alex brought gardening tools and worked alongside Mrs. Helen to restore the garden. New flower seedlings were planted, bringing with them the hope of a brighter new beginning. Since the day Alex began helping Mrs. Helen take care of her garden, his afternoons after school became busy but filled with joy. The little garden in front of Mrs. Helen's house started to transform, with the old flower beds replaced by new seedlings. Together, Alex and Mrs. Helen chose to plant the flowers that Mr. Henry had loved: red roses, yellow chrysanthemums, and a few fragrant lavender bushes. One afternoon, while watering the newly planted flowers, Alex turned to Mrs. Helen, who was sitting on a wooden chair under the shade of a tree. Mrs. Helen, I think this garden will soon be as beautiful as it used to be. I'll help you take care of it every week. Mrs. Helen smiled, her eyes shining with happiness. Thank you, Alex. I can't express how grateful I am. These days have truly been a blessing I never expected. They chatted together, sharing simple stories about life. Alex talked about school, the mischievous antics of his classmates, while Mrs. Helen shared memories of her childhood, growing up on a small farm in the countryside. Gradually, Alex's afternoons at Mrs. Helen's house became a regular part of his life. After finishing their gardening, they would sit together on the porch, sipping tea and enjoying the homemade cookies Mrs. Helen baked. It was the most peaceful time of the day, and Alex felt as though he were sitting beside a real grandmother. One afternoon, as Alex sat on the sofa in the living room reading a book, Mrs. Helen emerged from her bedroom carrying a small box. The wooden box, brown and intricately carved with classic patterns, exuded an air of elegance. Mrs. Helen gently placed it on the table in front of Alex and sat down beside him. Alex, I want to show you something very special, she said, her voice filled with emotion. Alex looked at her curiously. What is it, Mrs. Helen? Mrs. Helen opened the box, revealing an old but gleaming pocket watch. The watch face was meticulously preserved, showing no signs of scratches or wear. On the back, a finely engraved inscription read, "Always be kind, Henry. This is Mr. Henry's watch, my late husband's," Mrs. Helen said, her voice heavy with sentiment. He carried it with him throughout his career as a police officer. To him, it wasn't just a watch. It was a reminder that every day is an opportunity to do something good. Alex picked up the watch, feeling its significance. Mrs. Helen, I can tell Mr. Henry was a very special person. I truly admire him. Mrs. Helen smiled, her eyes glowing with pride. Mr. Henry believed that every act of kindness, no matter how small, could change someone's life. And Alex, you're doing just that. You've changed my life. Alex looked at the watch in his hand, a wave of deep emotion washing over him. Mrs. Helen, I want to be like Mr. Henry, someone who helps others and spreads kindness wherever he goes. The bond between Alex and Mrs. Helen grew stronger with each passing day. They were no longer just neighbors helping each other. They had become like a real grandmother and grandson. Alex even started calling her Grandma, something he had never imagined doing before. One day, Alex decided to tell his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Miller, about this special relationship. During dinner, as the family sat around the table, Alex eagerly shared, "Mom, Dad, today I helped Grandma Helen fix the kitchen faucet. She was so happy and even told me a wonderful story about her youth." Mr. Miller raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Grandma Helen? Are you talking about the lady who lives in the yellow house at the end of the street? We've noticed you've been visiting there a lot lately. What have you been helping her with?" "I've helped her fix her TV, take care of her garden, and spent time talking with her," Alex explained, his eyes shining. "Mrs. Helen is very lonely. I think she needs a friend." Mrs. Miller smiled, her expression filled with pride. "You're such a kind-hearted child, Alex. Not everyone notices when someone is lonely, let alone takes the time to help them. Do you think we should go visit Mrs. Helen ourselves?" Mr. Miller suggested. "We'd like to meet the person who's had such a big impact on you." Alex nodded enthusiastically. "She'd definitely be thrilled to meet you." Although Alex spent a lot of time with Mrs. Helen, he faced a significant challenge at school. Math, a subject he had never been good at, was becoming his biggest struggle. After his most recent math test, he received a low grade, which left him feeling incredibly disappointed. That afternoon, Alex brought his test to Mrs. Helen's house. Sitting on the sofa, he held the paper with the glaring red score, his eyes filled with sadness. "Grandma Helen, I really don't understand why I'm so bad at this. I've tried studying, but I just can't get it." Mrs. Helen sat down beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Alex, I know how frustrating this feels, but everyone has their own strengths and weaknesses. The important thing is not to give up." She pulled out a blank sheet of paper and a pen, then began to explain each question on Alex's test in a simple and easy-to-understand way. She also shared stories about the times when Mr. Henry struggled with studying law and how he overcame those challenges. "You know, Henry used to think he wasn't good enough either," Mrs. Helen said with a gentle smile. "But he always reminded himself that perseverance is more important than anything else." With Mrs. Helen's guidance, Alex started to understand where he had gone wrong on his test. "I'll try harder, Grandma Helen. I want to prove that I can do it." Mrs. Helen beamed at him. "That's the spirit I love to see, Alex. And remember, I'll always be here if you need help." A few weeks later, Alex walked into his classroom with a confidence he had never felt before. Today, his math teacher would be returning the latest test. After days of diligent studying and the dedicated help from Mrs. Helen, Alex felt he had a better grasp of the material and hoped for a good result. "Alex Miller," the teacher called, holding out his test paper. "I'm very pleased to see your improvement." Alex's hands trembled as he took the paper. When he saw the score, his eyes lit up. B+. It wasn't a perfect score, but it was the highest grade he had ever achieved in math. He felt as though a massive weight had been lifted off his shoulders. As soon as school ended, Alex pedaled his bike as fast as he could to Mrs. Helen's house. The moment he stepped through the gate, he shouted, "Grandma Helen, I did it!" Mrs. Helen, who was watering her newly planted rose bushes, looked up with a radiant smile. "Alex, what is it?" He quickly held out the test paper in front of her. "I got a B+. I can't believe I actually did it." Mrs. Helen took the paper, her eyes brimming with tears of joy. "I knew it, Alex. I knew you could do it. You've worked so hard, and I'm so proud of you. I couldn't have done it without you," Alex said, his eyes shining. "You've helped me so much." "No, Alex," Mrs. Helen replied gently. "You did it yourself. I just helped you see the potential you already had." That entire afternoon, they celebrated with cookies and tea. Alex felt a surge of happiness and confidence in his heart. He realized that any challenge could be overcome with perseverance and the support of those who believe in you. After his first success, Alex began to see the world around him from a fresh perspective. He realized that kindness wasn't just about helping one person. It could ripple out and touch the lives of many. Inspired by the stories of Mr. Henry, Alex decided to do more to help his community. One afternoon, while riding his bike through the neighborhood, Alex saw Mr. Jenkins, an elderly neighbor, struggling to carry a heavy bag of groceries from the supermarket to his house. Without hesitation, Alex stopped and asked, "Can I help you with that?" Mr. Jenkins looked surprised for a moment but then gave a warm smile. "Thank you, Alex. I'm getting old, and even small tasks like this have become difficult." Alex helped carry the bag all the way to Mr. Jenkins's house, staying for a short chat before heading back to Mrs. Helen's home. When he told her about what had happened, she beamed with pride. "You know, Alex, that's exactly the spirit of Mr. Henry. He always said that even the smallest act of kindness could bring great joy to someone else." In the days that followed, Alex continued looking for opportunities to help others. He cleaned up trash in the park, helped younger kids in the neighborhood with their homework, and even organized a neighborhood cleanup event with the participation of many residents. One morning, Alex received an unexpected call from Officer Daniels, a former colleague of Mr. Henry. Officer Daniels said he wanted to meet with Alex and Mrs. Helen to discuss something important. When Alex and Mrs. Helen arrived at Officer Daniels' office, he invited them to sit down and began to speak. "Mrs. Helen has told me so much about you, Alex. You're a remarkable young man. Your spirit of kindness and willingness to help others reminds me so much of Mr. Henry. That's why we want to do something to continue his legacy." Alex looked at Mrs. Helen, confused. "What's going on, Grandma?" Mrs. Helen smiled, taking Alex's hand. "Alex, Officer Daniels and I have established a scholarship fund just for you. I want to make sure you can pursue your dreams without worrying about financial burdens." I don't know what to say," Alex stammered, his eyes brimming with tears. "Grandma Helen, this is so much more than I deserve." "No, Alex," Mrs. Helen said, her voice filled with emotion. "This is how Mr. Henry and I wanted to thank you. You haven't just helped me. You've brought hope and vibrancy back to this community." Overcome with emotion, tears streamed down Alex's cheeks. "I promise, I'll study hard and make sure I don't let you down." Since learning about the scholarship fund, Alex became even more determined to study hard and live up to the values that Mrs. Helen and Mr. Henry cherished. He began exploring more stories about Mr. Henry to draw inspiration. One afternoon, as Alex sat on the sofa in the living room, Mrs. Helen brought out an old photograph. It was a picture of Mr. Henry in his police uniform, standing proudly next to his patrol car. "This is one of my favorite photos," she said, her voice filled with pride. He wasn't just a police officer. He was someone who always put the community's needs above his own. Alex stared intently at the photo, filled with admiration. "Grandma, I want to be like Mr. Henry, not just doing good deeds, but also inspiring others to do the same." Mrs. Helen smiled gently, her eyes full of affection. "Alex, you're already that kind of person, and I believe you'll achieve even greater things." In the days that followed, Alex spent time writing down the stories Mrs. Helen shared about Mr. Henry. He wanted to preserve these memories and use them as motivation to live a better life every day. After many days of dedicated studying, Alex received an assignment from his history teacher. Each student had to prepare a presentation about a significant historical event and its impact on today's society. Initially intrigued, Alex found himself unsure of what topic to choose once he got home. That afternoon, as usual, Alex visited Mrs. Helen's house. Sitting at the kitchen table, his chin resting on his hand, his face was full of uncertainty. "Grandma Helen, I have a history assignment, and I have no idea where to start." "History?" Mrs. Helen chuckled lightly, placing a cup of tea in front of him. "That was always my favorite subject. Tell me, what's the assignment?" "The teacher wants us to pick a significant historical event and explain its impact on society today." Alex explained. But I don't know which event to choose that would be both interesting and meaningful. Mrs. Helen pondered for a moment before her eyes lit up. Alex, have you ever heard about the civil rights movement in America? It's one of the most important periods in our country's history. And Mr. Henry was involved in protecting peaceful protests during that time. Alex looked at her with curiosity. Really? Grandma? What did he do? Mrs. Helen nodded. Her eyes filled with pride. Mr. Henry believed deeply that everyone deserves to be treated fairly, regardless of their skin color or background. He was often assigned to protect protest groups from the threat of violence. He always said, "Defending justice isn't just a police officer's job. It's a human responsibility." Hearing her story, Alex felt his heart light up with inspiration. Grandma Helen, I'm going to choose the civil rights movement as my topic. And I want to include Mr. Henry's story in my presentation. In the days that followed, Alex spent countless hours at Mrs. Helen's house researching the civil rights movement. Mrs. Helen not only shared stories from her own memories, but also lent Alex some of Mr. Henry's old materials, including his journal and photos from his time as a police officer. Alex, this is Mr. Henry's journal, Mrs. Helen said, placing the worn leather-bound book on the table. He always recorded his thoughts and experiences after each day at work. It might help you understand the spirit of the movement more deeply. Alex carefully picked up the journal, turning each page with reverence. Mr. Henry's neat handwriting described his daily experiences in vivid detail, the tense days on duty, and the proud moments of protecting those fighting for justice and equality. Mr. Henry truly was a hero, Alex said in awe, his eyes sparkling. I'll make sure my presentation does him justice. The evening before his presentation, Alex had everything prepared. He practiced in front of the mirror, imagining himself standing before his class. In his mind, the image of Mr. Henry appeared like a guiding light, illuminating the path Alex was determined to follow. The day of the presentation arrived, and Alex walked into the classroom with a mix of confidence and nervousness. When it was his turn, he stood in front of the class, his presentation projected onto the big screen. With a clear and passionate voice, Alex began to talk about the civil rights movement, the challenges its participants faced, and the contributions of people like Mr. Henry in protecting justice. The entire class listened intently, some even taking notes. When Alex shared Mr. Henry's story, the room seemed to fall completely silent. The images and stories he presented not only inspired but also gave everyone a deeper understanding of the significance of courage and kindness. When Alex finished his presentation, the class erupted in applause. His teacher smiled warmly and said, "Alex, this is one of the best presentations I've ever heard. You didn't just share history. You conveyed its spirit and emotions in such a heartfelt way." Alex bowed his head in gratitude, his heart swelling with pride. As he left the classroom, he knew he had done something meaningful, not just for the assignment but also to honor Mr. Henry and the values he stood for. Winter arrived, bringing its characteristic chill with gentle winds and bare tree branches. But inside Mrs. Helen's small house, the atmosphere remained warm, thanks to Alex and his family. After his presentation, Alex had shared the entire story with his parents, and they decided to invite Mrs. Helen to move into the spare room in their home. "Mrs. Helen, you shouldn't be living alone in this cold winter," Mr. Miller said when the family visited her. "If you don't mind, we'd love for you to move in with us. You'll have company every day." Mrs. Helen looked at them, her eyes welling up with emotion. "Thank you so much. I don't know how to express my gratitude. After all these years, I finally feel like I have a family again." Since moving into Alex's home, Mrs. Helen no longer felt lonely. Mornings began with the aroma of pancakes she made for the family, and evenings ended with laughter shared around the fireplace. Alex and Mrs. Helen often sat together at the kitchen table. He worked on his homework while she read books or knitted. One evening, as the family gathered together, Mrs. Helen smiled at Alex. "You know, Alex, I've always believed that kindness is the greatest gift we can give each other. You've given me that, and now I feel so lucky to have you." "No, Grandma Helen," Alex replied, his eyes filled with sincerity. "You are the greatest gift to me." In the cold of winter, the hearts of Mrs. Helen and Alex were warmer than ever, knowing they had truly found a family in each other. Winter gradually gave way to the warm sunshine of spring. During this time, Alex not only became a diligent student but also an indispensable part of his community. Inspired by Mr. Henry's stories and Mrs. Helen's encouragement, he continued participating in volunteer activities. One day, Alex received a notice from the community center about a neighborhood cleanup event. Immediately, an idea sparked in his mind. "Grandma Helen, I think we should encourage everyone to join. You could also inspire them by sharing Mr. Henry's story." Mrs. Helen smiled, her eyes sparkling with joy. "That's a wonderful idea, Alex. I'd be delighted." Over the following days, Alex and Mrs. Helen went door to door in the neighborhood to invite people to participate. With Alex's sincerity and Mrs. Helen's inspiring stories, they managed to persuade many neighbors to join. On the day of the cleanup, Alex stood in front of the crowd with a microphone and said, "Today, we're not just cleaning our neighborhood. We're building a stronger community. We're doing this not just for ourselves but for those around us." After Alex's speech, the crowd erupted in applause. Under his guidance, the participants divided into groups to clean the park, sidewalks, and plant new greenery. Mrs. Helen, despite her age, enthusiastically watered plants and encouraged everyone. By the end of the day, the entire neighborhood was spotless and full of life, reflecting the spirit of unity and togetherness shared by all. A week after the neighborhood cleanup, the community center organized a small ceremony to honor those who had made significant contributions to the area. Alex and Mrs. Helen were invited as special guests. As they entered the hall, Alex felt a bit shy seeing so many people looking at him with admiration. Standing beside him, Mrs. Helen gently said, "Alex, today you're not just representing yourself but also the values you carry. Be proud of that." When the host invited Alex to the stage, he walked up amid applause from the audience. "Thank you all for believing in me," Alex said, his voice full of emotion. "What I've accomplished today is because of Mrs. Helen and the stories of Mr. Henry. They've inspired me to become the person I strive to be." When he finished, Alex was presented with a certificate of recognition and a bouquet of flowers. But what made him happiest was the proud look in Mrs. Helen's eyes as she stood in the audience, clapping endlessly. One summer afternoon, as Alex and Mrs. Helen sat on the porch, she suddenly pulled out a small box. Inside was Mr. Henry's medal, an honorary award he had received during his time as a police officer. "Alex, I want you to have this," Mrs. Helen said, her voice trembling. "Mr. Henry always said this medal belongs to someone he truly trusted. I believe you are the most deserving person." Alex took the medal, feeling that it was not just a keepsake but also a great responsibility. "I will never let you down," he said, his eyes glistening with tears. "I promise to live by the values Mr. Henry always believed in: kindness, fairness, and dedication." From that day on, Alex wore the medal under his shirt whenever he participated in community activities. It became a constant reminder to him to live up to the promises he had made. Autumn arrived, bringing chilly breezes and golden leaves scattered across the pathways. In the Miller household, however, the atmosphere remained warm and filled with laughter. Mrs. Helen was no longer just a neighbor. She had truly become a part of Alex's family. One evening, the family gathered around the fireplace. Mr. Miller read the newspaper, Mrs. Miller worked on her knitting, and Alex sat beside Mrs. Helen, listening intently as she shared old stories. "Grandma Helen, I think you and Mr. Henry have changed my life," Alex said, his voice full of emotion. "Without you, I wouldn't have understood the power of kindness." Mrs. Helen smiled, her eyes shining with affection. "Alex, I have to thank you too. You've given me a family. something I thought I had lost forever. The family sat together, sharing stories and memories. Laughter echoed, blending with the crackling of the firewood, painting a warm picture of love and togetherness. For Alex, he realized that the most important things in life weren't grand achievements but the simple, meaningful moments shared with loved ones. And from that day forward, he knew that wherever life might take him, he would always carry with him the love and kindness that Mrs. Helen and Mr. Henry had taught him.